Hello, arty peoples, and welcome to another episode of Jerry's Live. My name is Emmy Klein.
And I'm Mott Tuman.
And we are your hosts this evening. So I am very excited for today's show. I'll let you introduce it. I'm
this
excited.
is JL288. That is our class code tonight, and it's all about the basics of gouache. So if you see anything during the show tonight that you want to buy, you want to check out for yourself, it's going to be listed in our teacher's cart, which you can find on JerrysArtarama.com. You just type in that code, JL282, 288, 288 into the search bar, and it'll bring up all the stuff for you to find, so it won't be hard.
Yeah. So that will show you all the things, and we better jump straight in because we have a lot of things to talk about with gouache.
Yes.
Very specifically, let's talk about what gouache is first. So first things first. Gouache. It has a lot of vowels in the word. It is pronounced...
I'm so sorry. That was a silly mistake.
It's alright. We're going to pay with those later.
Yes.
But yeah, it is pronounced gouache. Just like you would wash a plate in your dishes and all that thing. You know, but with a G in the front. So gouache. That's how you pronounce it.
Yes.
Now it is all it is an opaque watercolor. Now I'm talking about a traditional gouache because now on the market, there is such things as acryl gouache and acrylic gouache, things like that. Anytime you see those, the acrylic kind of word in with the name, or if it says something about like it's permanent and something like that, that means that it's not a traditional gouache. We are going to be working with traditional gouache tonight. So
Yeah. And the main differences between those two is that if you find something that's an acryl gouache, lots of people will compare it to like a matte acrylic. So it has that acrylic polymer in it. You can still wet it down and work it like gouache while it is wet. But once it dries, it is permanent, just like acrylic is. So you won't be able to re-wet it afterwards.
Yeah.
This is design gouache, which is also another term for traditional gouache.
yes, that's we're going to be working with the Turner brand tonight. So one of my personal favorites, I do love the Turner design gouache. They come in a lot of really amazing colors, even fluorescents that yes, they do fluoresce under black light.
Yes.
So we're gonna show you that later on. So what a gouache is, kind of the differences between them. I believe we probably should show you the biggest difference between gouache and watercolor, and we are visual people, so we have a little demonstration to show you here.
Yes.
So I have a traditional watercolor, which is just the same brand, Turner, and then Mott is going to be working with the design gouache. So the biggest difference between the two of these, because they both will re-wet after they dry, and they're both going to be really bright and vibrant straight out of the tube. The biggest difference is that this watercolor is going to have a transparency to it, while the gouache is going to have an opacity to it. Hence why we have a lovely variety of lines here. And just real quick, for those of you watching, I wanted to kind of go over what the lines were before we officially obliterate them with color. The first one up here is the Pentel Pocket, oh gosh, I always forget the name of it. It's like Pocket ink brush
Liner?
Pocket liner, pocket brush pen. I think that's it. It's pocket brush something.
Yes, pocket brush pen.
Pocket brush pen, yes, confirmed. Pentel pocket brush pen, and that's one of my favorites to line my work with. Another one of my favorites is the Accurate Technical pens. Now this is the waterproof version, whereas the blue packaging is not waterproof. This is gonna have that kind of waterproofness. Now also, the one thing with this though is that it's technically water resistant, which means it can slightly pick up, especially if you don't let it dry in enough time. But even after you let it fully dry, there's still a possibility for this pen to slightly pick up. Whereas like the rest of these, the inks here that I've used are waterproof, so they will stay put. And then the two lines here, not actually the last, these two lines, the big thick one and the thinner one, are both the new New York Central waterproof India ink. This is a lovely dark black ink line, but I just wanted to have something that was a little bit thicker. And then of course we have pencil down here, which I hope you guys can see. It's a little light on the camera, but it is still down there. So we wanted to visually show you the difference between watercolor and gouache.
I'm gonna mix this up a little.
All right, and I'm gonna actually pull my water over before
And
I
this
forget.
is what we're doing right now is gonna be considered a mass tone, which is your paint straight out of the tube with no water in it.
Yes.
So,
I'm
dry
actually,
brushing.
you know what, I'm gonna need a little bit more than that because like I just realized we're gonna have to pull lines all the way down.
Yes.
Okay. So, you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Boop.
I'm gonna pull a little bit more of that. You can see just how thick it is when it's not watered down at all, and how dry brushing it, you'll get a really fine
Now-
texture there.
I'm hoping you guys can see this on camera because I can see the line through the watercolor, especially when I get down here. Now, normally I would not go this thick. Like there's even a blob of watercolor up here that I'm actually going to just take that and steal it and put it on my palette over here because I'm going to work with that. But this is going to dry and it's going to have that line show through. This right here, when it dries, you're not going to see it at all. Now, I also did have a lovely example prepared for you.
Yes.
That we're going to do the same thing here. This side is the gouache. This is the watercolor. As you can see, it dried. It's completely transparent. This is watercolor. You're going to get a really vibrant color, but it's transparent. Gouache, this is starting to be mixed with water, and it still has an opacity. Only until I start adding more and more water do you start to see that line through it. Now, the one very tricky thing to know with gouache is that straight out of the tube, if you have it, it's like you said, it was like dry.
Yeah,
Right?
it gets very, very thick to the point where if you don't use any water when you're putting down your gouache like this, you have a high risk of your gouache cracking.
Yeah, which if you go to that side camera, I can show you an up-close example of exactly what we mean. There you go. So this is my gouache side, and I hope you guys can see that. Is that coming across on camera? Right here where it got real thick, it's completely cracked. Like if it were closer to the edge of my sketchbook here and I would be able to flex it a little bit more, and I wonder if I can actually, I might be able to actually like completely pop it right off. And that's on paper, oops, sorry, keep it on camera. On paper, it's just gonna have that slight flexibility to it to where that gouache, like I probably could just, yeah, it can come right off. Now the thinner applications aren't gonna have that same issue because they will kind of stay with the paper a little bit more. It's just not as brittle as it's straight out of the tube. So think of gouache as like it's concentrated, you know? You're going to want to water it down.
Yeah, it is not your go-to if you want to do impasto painting.
Yes, definitely not. Now, actually, we do have the mixing palette that we wanted to show you kind of the right consistency of what you're going to want to go for when it comes to gouache. Yes. And I will let you take over for that one because it's kind of a feel thing. So straight out of the tube, I mean, what would you credit that to being like?
It's kind of like sour cream. It's really creamy, it's thick, and when you water it down, it gets to more like a buttery kind of consistency. And this right here,
Yeah.
I put out a decent amount of paint here. This is gonna go a really long way.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna make sure I add in quite a bit of water to this. Let's see.
So you can probably even grab my water too. Yeah.
You can see how that waters down really, really quickly. And you can even use, some people will call gouache essentially an opaque watercolor because it has a lot of the same binders and essentially it has most of the same ingredients that watercolor has.
Yeah.
The biggest difference though is that, like gouache, the way that they get it more opaque is that the pigments themselves are actually larger. So you're not going to get as much of that transparency. But that's kind of the consistency you want to go for if you don't want it to crack or anything like that.
Yeah.
And you can water it down a lot more than that, as
Oh, yeah.
Emmy showed in her sketchbook.
We're definitely going to keep pulling lines as well to kind of show you how adding more and more water will affect your wash there. And actually, I'm going to give that back to you.
Yeah.
Well, you do that. I'm going to work with the watercolor so you can see just how even though I'm using a really vibrant color, it's still going to have that transparency. But the difference between the two of them. So we're going to pull some lines. And while we're doing that, I'm sure it's a great time for questions that I'm sure we have.
Can you mix it with mediums or only with water?
No, what kind of mediums would you be mixing? That's I guess the question.
I believe, so there's not a lot of gouache specific mediums out there, but I do believe that gouache is compatible with watercolor mediums since it essentially consists of the same things.
It's a pigment and gum arabic is the binder. So it literally is like the exact same thing as a watercolor. We were talking about this earlier with the opacity. It can vary from brand to brand on how they achieve opacity. A lot of them are going to actually just let the pigment be the reason why it's opaque. And it's just a different way of how they, I guess, kind of mill the pigments down. So if their pigments are a lot thicker, they're going to kind of block the view, I guess, a little bit more, as you would think. Whereas like watercolor, if you grind it down finer, you can get a really vibrant color, but it's going to have a little bit more space, kind of a little bit more elbow room, if you will, you know? And that's how you can achieve that really vibrant color. So yeah, I would assume that the binder, like the mediums for watercolors would work the same. Now, granted, like we said, that there is an acrylic gouache out there, and that would be essentially the same thing as a gouache, but it has that acrylic polymer added to it. So if you were to take gouache and mix an acrylic medium into it, that's where you're now starting to get into that realm.
Yes.
Where it's going to have that permanence once it dries. And so you're no longer going to be able to reactivate it when it's like down on the paper and fully dry.
The color you're using now is the luminous red, right?
Negative.
I, right now, am using permanent scarlet, which is still, as you can see, gouache is known for being super vibrant. It's still this really vibrant color, but we'll show you the luminous red in a little bit. It is...
Oh, you can tell the difference between them. I'll even put a little swatch down here on the same page, but I am using Pyrrole Red. We just wanted to get two different reds that kind of were similar. They're the same brand. It's just I didn't actually happen to have the exact same colors that were in the sets that we're using. So it's just something close. And that luminous red, it's quite different.
Yes.
And you will see.
It has almost a little bit of like a pinky undertone.
It does. It does. And I love it so, so much. You have another question?
Yes. Do you need to use specific brushes for gouache versus watercolor?
No, because remember the binder is the same. All you're dealing with are pigments and the gum arabic binder. So your watercolor brushes can be the same as your gouache brushes.
Now, except for when it comes to acrylic gouache,
That's the difference, yes.
that
That's
acrylic
true.
polymer is what is known for getting caught in brushes, which make them difficult to switch between mediums like watercolor and acrylic. So when you're working with an acrylic gouache, it is essentially the same as working with an acrylic in that sense. So
Yeah.
probably want to keep your brushes for traditional gouache and acrylic gouache separate.
Yeah.
And then, can you erase gouache with a magic eraser like you can with watercolor?
That, not quite as well. So because watercolor has a higher transparency and a higher water content is why those magic erasers work so well. If you have a really thin layer of gouache like this, it might work well.
Yeah.
But since, you have this layer of opacity is achieved because of those really thick pigments, the magic eraser is not going to do you much good.
Oh, I love that. Put the gouache and the watercolor.
Ooh,
Technology.
yeah.
I love that. Yay, team. But yeah, no, I was also going to say, personally, I would always suggest not using a magic eraser on your watercolors, mostly because it then destroys your paper.
Yeah.
It's kind of abrasive. That's how water will pick it up and kind of reactivate the pigments, but that abrasiveness is what's kind of think of it like sandpaper. It's not going to destroy your paper, but like if you plan on painting on top of it afterwards, that's where your paper surface is going to change.
I wonder too, I don't know this for certain, but I wonder if the magic eraser might affect your paper's archivability, because I'm not sure what the acid content in that is.
Yeah.
So there could be a potential that it'll damage your paper over the long time, or you'll see like yellowing where it was used. I'm not 100% certain about that, but it's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I would definitely have a little bit of pause for, it might have an effect. But the really cool thing about gouache, unlike watercolor, is that if you want to put something lighter on top of your layers, you can do that.
Yeah.
Which we're going to show you in a kind of a demonstration afterwards. So yeah, as you can see still here though, it's quite opaque, but as Mott was adding more and more water, you're getting those watercolor washes. Now we wanted to really show you this in the same comparison, because if you are someone who can't afford to have both watercolor and gouache, you can still achieve some watercolor effects with gouache, whereas like you can still get a really beautiful, vibrant color, but that transparency is still going to be here. So that's the trade-off between the two.
Yes.
So I personally use them both together because
Yeah.
it's like the same thing in my head.
Yeah.
And I'm again talking about a traditional gouache. So
Keep
I
in
use them with
mind
Canon.
though, some gouaches, depending on what brand you use. Now we're using Turner's Design gouache. This is an excellent high quality gouache. And you guys can see when I water it down, it looks almost identical to some of the watercolor here. But sometimes with other design gouaches, if you add too much water to these, you can see pigments start to break apart, and you won't be able to get as smooth as a glaze as you can with watercolor.
Yeah.
Or as vibrant as a glaze with watercolor.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the trade-off there.
and that's just going to vary from brand to brand.
Yeah.
So it's something that you should always test out and play with. I would always suggest, whether or not you're getting watercolor or a new set of gouache at home, start doing something like this, seeing how much water will affect the paint, and kind of how you'll get like a sweet spot that you're like, I love the way that this glides across the surface of my paper and it gives me that color that I'm looking for. But you can also do something like this with it
Yeah.
as well, which is fantastic. Now, we need to get into the fun things with painting, which is actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to completely take that back. Before we get into the fun things, I wanted to show you the luminous red, but next
swatch
to
it.
this one before I forget. Now, this one actually, it's the same exact thing as what you're going to find in a tube. It just happens to come in a jar. Because we decided to go in bulk because we love this color so much.
And you can get, I don't believe any other of the luminous colors are in stock right now, but all of the luminous colors come in, you can get them in large jars like this.
Yeah. All right, let me just pull a little bit from the lid here.
When you're buying gouache, what do you look for to make sure you're getting traditional gouache and not the acrylic gouache?
It should say on the container, it should say acrylic gouache, acrylic gouache. Traditional gouache is normally called design gouache or just gouache. So just read carefully. They'll
It
always
should
label
say-
it.
Yeah, whether or not it reactivates after it's dry, it should be in the description. Also, we had an entire show before here with just me, where I had an entire show and I pulled every single item that we sold that was labeled as gouache, and I went through every brand and I figured out whether or not it reactivated, what the binder was, and you guys can absolutely check out that show as well. I hope that the vibrancy of this comes
Maybe we
across
should
on
get
camera
the dynamic
too.
on that.
Ooh yeah, let's see if it makes a difference.
Because the camera really does dull this color. It is
It's hard for
incredibly
the
vibrant.
poor cameras.
Yeah.
Our cameras are trying. Here we go. Let's see. I feel like once I start
Oh, yeah, there
turning
you go.
it, you can really see how bright that color is. So like it is, it's bizarre.
Mm-hmm.
Like the shadow is what helps it make look more luminous. But yeah, our cameras are trying, but like it's hard to pick up, but in person it's so vibrant. I love it so
and they
much.
do activate with a black light.
Yes.
If any of you just happen to have a black light. I don't think we do, but it's really cool.
It's over there, and that's okay. But now I will say, now that this is dry right here, like I can touch it, and I think it's dry. You see how quickly that reactivates?
Mm-hmm.
That is a traditional gouache.
Yes.
You have a question?
We do. How light fast are Turner's gouaches?
They vary, just like every paint is going to, but it's going to depend on the pigment. So it'll vary from color to color, whereas like the luminescent colors, they're not light fast at all. It's just the nature of fluorescent colors. The fluorescents are not stable, but I know all of the rest of Turner's, like the standard colors, they're pretty high on the light fast rating. but that should be found in every single one of the colors listed on our website.
Yes.
It should have it written in what we call the tech notes. There's a little button that looks like a little page that's turning down, and if you click that, it should tell you the light fast rating in there as well.
And I believe it even has it on the bottle. It has star ratings essentially on each bottle. So it's very hard to see from here, but like here under the label, you see these tiny little stars. Will tell you how light fast they are. And the more stars, the more light fast, I believe.
Yes. You want a lot of stars. Stars for everybody.
Yes.
All right,
And,
so.
speaking of reactivation really
Yes.
quick, if any of you are curious about like traveling with gouache or panning gouache like you would with watercolors, you can pan traditional gouache like this. And you can see they won't pan quite as well as watercolors. Lots of them will have cracking in them, but you can see like the Turner gouache in particular, I think pan very well. This is the luminescent red right there.
It has like a really fun little like almost like a little divot right in the middle, but that's just sometimes this is only one pour, so we didn't actually do this in layers or anything, but this is what I've seen a lot of the times in gouache is that they're gonna crack.
Yeah.
Because they're a little bit more brittle than watercolors. They don't have that kind of flexibility like watercolors do have. But that, even with a crack, you can still use that.
Yeah.
I still have several watercolor palettes that have gouache stuck in there, and my gouache is like, it's broken apart, and I will squirt more paint on top of that, let it dry, and just leave it in there.
Yeah.
And I love it.
The only thing to keep in mind when you pan your gouache, I mean, we can even show it right here, is that when you use gouache from a pan, it's not going to be quite as opaque as straight from the tube.
Yeah.
Just because you're adding more water to it, essentially, in order to get it to re-wet.
Yeah, you kind of have to get it reactivated.
And I can show you real quick. This pan, it will take a little longer for it to re-wet than watercolor.
It's
but
not that long. Like you can
Yeah.
start painting right now, but yeah, to get a really, really vibrant color,
And you
you're
can
gonna
see
have to
how-
like work it into the pan or let a droplet of water kind of sit on top, and that'll reactivate it. But honestly, I've had really good results from panning the Turner design gouache and not having it really
Yes.
be a terrible difference.
Yeah, I mean, I love panned gouache.
Yeah.
I mean, you can even see the difference here. There's not much of a difference.
Yeah.
There's a little bit.
It's very
But-
subtle. Let's see if you guys can. Yeah. So this was the one in the pan, and this is straight from the tube. There was a glare on it. I'm sorry. So there you go. That's the difference, and it reactivates pretty quick. All right, now we can do the fun things and
Yes.
paint. Because we want to show you kind of how to approach starting a painting with gouache in our favorite ways, which is slightly different. But I'm going to let Mott kind of go first because there would be a lot going on if we did. Actually, I will even like scooch over and let you kind of take over more of the table.
Okay, so this is, oh no. You can see I got paint all over my hand and then I got it on my painting. So don't do that.
But it's gouache. It reactivates. You can pick
Let's
that
see.
right back up.
Let's see if I can pick it back up real quick.
You definitely want a clean brush though.
I'm trying to get it.
I was like,
I'm trying to get it clean.
I can see the
know.
pink in that brush, and you're gonna just go and spread it around. Oh
Okay,
no!
it's good, it's good. Okay, let's see if I can just pick that back up because it is on a blue surface. Yeah, there you go. You can see that blue is reactivating too and kind of covering it.
Like it never happened.
There you go.
Magic.
There's gonna be like a little bit of residue where kind of like the water pushed it away a little bit.
Yeah, but you have some of that happening over here too.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's inconsistent. No, something
And-
that I've done is that I've taken a larger brush that's, again, also clean and kind of worked my way back into the sky or like a larger area and just pretended like it was intentional.
And it's opaque, so you can paint over it too.
It's true.
Yeah. So
Very true.
this was the painting that I did for you guys. You can see I actually put some of the luminescent red right in its leg here and in its head up here. But gouache as a medium is excellent for layering, the same way watercolor is. They're both kind of layering mediums. So I have my little, I believe this is a stork. I'm not entirely sure.
All right, my bird enthusiasts. What kind of bird is this?
Yes.
Help.
But I'm just going to use my old painting as a reference here. I'm going to pull some of my water down.
Probably should have had several things of water because now we have just red water.
Yeah,
It's, luckily
yeah.
with us, we have the 3-weld Creative Mark brush washer. Or, Brush washer, yeah, that's right.
Brush basin.
Brush basin. And so this is where I usually knock off the majority of my pigment, but we still have some clean water. But
So I think I'm gonna start. We have our 18 set of Turner Design Gouache. Or is it? Yes, 18
Yeah.
set of Turner Design Gouache. And I'm trying to remember what colors I used on the beak because I think I used a straight. I might have used permanent orange or permanent yellow deep. So I'm gonna try some permanent yellow deep straight on this guy's beak here.
And if you guys are interested in this, while you're pulling the paints out there, if you're interested in the 18 set, we also do, I believe, have a smaller 12 set, which is also still really excellent. I love that one as well. But the thing with the 18 set that I'm really excited about is that there are some colors in here that have a slight fluorescence to it, like the rose violet, I believe the brilliant violet, and is that it? I believe
think so,
that's
yes.
it. Yeah, so these two will fluoresce also under black light, but they also, I think, have another pigment added to it. So it's not a single pigment color, but it does have that really fun fluorescence about it, which I love. I don't know why I've been adding fluorescent paints to all of the things, but I've been adding it to all of my artwork, and it just makes me so happy.
You've got me hooked on fluorescence too recently. I'm like putting them. I'm putting it into here.
Let's
Okay.
okay. Also, while you're starting that, I
make sure I
did
don't
want
have
to
more
show you
paint on my
guys, whilst I have this, Mutt also added just a tiny touch of gold to the wings. So if I start rotating it, you can see the gold shimmer in the top of the wings there.
And that is, the Turner Gouache metallics are really wonderful when you get those super opaque metallics. That's this gold right here.
It's so fun. I love it so much. Sorry, I'm gonna put your painting down and let you work.
It really worked excellently too, because I believe they can post the reference photo that I used for this in the chat. But if you look at that reference photo, you can see where the gold is on the wings. Like the sun is reflecting this bird's wings and making it so shiny that gold works perfectly. Okay, I'm trying not to lean over this while I paint. I got some shaky hands today though.
Happens. We need some snacks, please.
Yeah.
We have a question?
Yes. Can you explain the difference between fluorescent and iridescent?
Yes, absolutely. So fluorescent means it's that really vibrant, kind of crazy color, which will activate under a black light. So the ones that will glow under black light, you know, any of those really funky, vibrant colors that make you think of like 1980s jazzercise. So iridescence means that it has a sparkle to it. So when I say an iridescent, I mean something like a silver or a gold, and that is probably going to mostly come from a mica flake, which is like they grind it down and it has that sparkle to it. Now, this is what me personally, I would consider this metallic because it has that opacity to it. An iridescence in my mind has no opacity to it. You can lay it down and it's a transparent color. It might have a slight shift color to it, but it's going to have a sparkle that kind of covers the whole thing. We were just talking about this iridescent watercolor that you were using that was iridescent blue.
I think it was the Marie's.
The Marie's has an
Interference
iridescence.
blue.
Oh, interference. That's
it's-
the word I was looking for.
Yes.
Interference is the one I was thinking of. Again, we can use watercolor and gouache interchangeably. Again, traditional gouache though, not the...
I will say, one of the things that's great about acrylic gouache, if you want to use it with gouache like this, is if you want, like, I have this blue background color, which I actually cut around my bird to paint. It wasn't like I didn't paint it blue and then paint the bird on top. But if I were to do something like that, acrylic gouache is great because it's not going to reactivate and it's going to look just like the rest of your gouaches. So if you want to use it for like a background painting, that's where it kind of shines.
Oh yeah. Also, you can technically put traditional gouache on top of acrylic gouache as well. Gouache and acrylic gouache are very mixed media friendly. That's why I showed you on top of a variety of inks, on top of pencil. And then you're going to see when I start working in the one that I'm going to do, kind of how I work with mine. Now I am noticing here, you shifted from that orange to like a brighter yellow. When it comes to transitioning between colors, how best do you think, like, what's your approach to that?
Okay, so for this transition right here, all I actually did was added a little bit of water and kind of pulled that gradient out. And that's best to do while your paint is still wet. You can wait for it to dry and pull out a gradient, but you're more likely to get kind of a line where your paint dried before you pulled the gradient out. So that's what I did to get that gradient. But when you want to mix two separate paints and get a gradient, you essentially have to do the same thing, where it's like you want to make sure your paints are wet. And I can do a little bit off to the side here. You know, I can lay down, okay, my paintbrush had the other color in it already, so that already kind of mixed on the paper.
Yeah.
But I'm going to actually
Which
clean
is something
that
that I've done several times before, is that I'll have a paint color on my brush and I will just dip into a new one and then I'll start painting, and it's almost like those, like the markers that kind of run out of the color, similar to that. Yeah, and it just kind of transitions naturally because it starts mixing it on the paper.
So, same with watercolors. I want to make sure my edge is still wet, and I'm going to pick up some of this coral color, and then I'm just going to drag it in there. You could see it started bleeding into the other color, and that's going to help your gradient.
Yeah.
And then I can even go back and kind of, with an almost dry brush, you want it slightly wet. You don't want to be adding a ton of water into this, otherwise it's
Yeah.
going to cause bleeding. But I can go in and kind of mix the colors even more.
Yeah.
And I can get
It
that
is all
gradient.
about water control. You don't need this sopping wet in order to get your colors to blend together. If you have too much water, you're going to have a problem getting that transition from one color to another. And it's one of those things like a sweet spot. You don't want it too dry and you don't want it too wet because both of those are going to cause problems. You have another question?
Do you have any tips for re-wetting your gouache? One of our users feels like they can't get the same consistency.
So, check what brand of gouache you're using. It could be one of those things where there's too much water involved and those pigments are breaking apart if you're re-wetting gouache. That is a problem with some brands. When you're using a brand that you don't think it's higher quality, you don't think it probably has that problem. Something you can do, well, one, water control, and also try using a spray bottle on it and spraying it down with water prior to painting with it. Like, spray it down and let it sit with that water for a second before you shove your brush in, because
Yeah.
that can help kind of evenly wet all of the pigments, so you're not picking up some that are like really dry and some are really wet, and it's getting uneven mixture. So
And with that, I have the perfect water bottle for you to use, which is our Aqua Mist, because not only does that have a spray that's really easy on the hands, because it will spray for a very long time. Actually, I feel like we have one around here. Can I have one, please? Yay! We use this a lot. So this is our Aqua Mist bottle, or sprayer. And I'm going to just spray it that direction
don't
because
spray it at
that's
me.
not towards Mott and it's not towards our camera equipment. But that was one spritz. It's really, really easy to use, really easy on the hands. Now the thing is with this, it gives you a really, really fine mist, which is lovely when you're trying to spritz your artwork, or even if you're trying to spritz like your palette. Like if you panned everything and you just want to get everything wet and starting to get them all reactivated, this is a really great thing because it will give you a fine mist, so it's not just like large droplets of water that are kind of a hit or miss. You know, it gives you a very good even spray, especially if you even start spraying it from like much further above your artwork and kind of moving almost like you would with spray paint. You want to kind of keep it moving side to side to where you're covering the whole area and keeping it high enough away that it's not going to be very concentrated in like the one spot that you're spraying it.
yes.
But great question.
So
Another one?
Yeah, sorry. David is wondering, he said when you are working with oils, you paint dark to light. With watercolors, you paint generally light to dark. Is there a suggested way to work with gouache?
I'll let you answer
So
that one.
gouache, you can kind of do both. You can wet it down like watercolors and work light to dark, but you can also work dark to light. And oftentimes when I'm doing gouache, I'm doing kind of a combination of both, where it's like, if I want a highlight to be the same color of the paper, then I'm just going to leave it open. I'm going to paint around it. But if I want it to look a little bit hazier, if I want some of the color underneath it to shine through, because while gouache is super opaque, keep in mind, unless you're using the mass tone like we did at the beginning, you're always going to be adding the littlest bit of water to it. So there's always a chance that you can, like, some of the colors underneath can shine through into your neuter colors. If you want a really vibrant white, you can use the paper and it's great, but then you can also use I mean, I can show you the comparison between the two, like the paper and then the straight white from the tube. They're gonna
That would
be
be good,
slightly
yeah.
different.
Like, I feel like the white, because it is a titanium white pigment in their white. And again, just remember that we are working specifically with this brand. Every brand is going to be slightly different.
Yes.
So you might have a white that has a little bit more of an off-white type of a tinge. It depends on the pigments that are used. So we're using one that is titanium white. It's going to be a stark white, which is fantastic. I've also seen like it called opaque white. Seen it called Chinese white. There's also the zinc white, but zinc white usually has less of an opacity to it, and it's more of like what you would consider like your mixing white, because it mixes with your colors without giving it like that chalky feel.
Oops. See, I just stuck my finger in it, trying to pick it up for you guys so you can see. Okay. So let's see if I can get this. It almost blends in. But I promise you guys there is like a slight difference. My swatch is right there.
Actually, maybe if we go to that side camera, we might be able to do that. And while we're doing that, you have another question?
We do. What is
there
the
we go.
difference between
Let's
an opaque watercolor and a gouache?
So there really isn't one. So technically, if
There
you
you go.
have a palette and it has like a white watercolor in it, lots of times that watercolor, even though it's labeled as watercolor, can just be considered a gouache. That's why a lot of times if you're going into competitive watercolor competitions, they don't allow white watercolor paint because they consider that to be a gouache.
Yes.
Now, there are like varying levels of opaqueness within gouache and watercolors. And for a lot of watercolors that are more opaque just naturally because those pigment particles just naturally are larger, they kind of get into gouache territory. Think of it more like a spectrum.
Yeah.
We like to like cut it up into like sweet categories, but is more like a spectrum. And there's even watercolors in the world, like in Japan, they specifically have a watercolor that's called Gonzai watercolor that is actually considered a gouache by a lot of people in the West because of how opaque it is.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a lot of mixing between the two categories. If you do enter a watercolor competition, just check their rules.
Yeah. You really want to make sure that the rules are followed, because they will
Yes.
definitely ask you questions like, is that white the paper or is that the paint? In a lot of watercolor like sets come with a white watercolor, and so it's not that they're trying to mislead you. It's just that it's a way of getting that opacity if that's what you're looking for.
Yeah.
Or even popping in like a highlight, like Mott said earlier. But it's definitely against a lot of the rules. If you
It's
use
not
them.
to like demonize white watercolor either. It
Yeah.
has its purpose.
Oh, yeah.
I use it all the time sometimes when I want, because if you just have the white of the paper, if you're just using water to water down your pigments, you're not going to get really a creamy texture. And sometimes I want that in my paints, and that white watercolor is going to get you that. So if some of you may have noticed, I have a really dark eye that I'm painting right now, and this is very small details, so it's kind of difficult to see. But instead of using black for that eye, I actually used a Prussian blue, which is this paint right here. You can see how
Amanda?
dark it is.
That's for you.
But
Amanda's favorite color.
it is not a true black. And the reason I'm doing that is like this painting has a lot of light colors, and you can see these wings get very dark, almost black. But I wanted it to kind of feel more cohesive with the environment. And since this bird is flying through a blue sky, I opted to go for a really dark blue rather than that black. And I didn't let the eye dry quite enough. So I'm gonna leave it alone for now because that black bled just a little bit into the fluorescence that I'm putting down. So keep in mind, gouache dries very fast, but it still has a drying time.
Yeah, because it does dry through evaporation, and just like watercolor would. So it'll be dry whenever the water that's in there evaporates off the surface of your paper. But that is another really great tip for anybody who's wanting to try gouache. If you're trying to get very crisp kind of layers that don't transition from one color to another, you have to let it fully dry. If it is slightly wet, it will completely bleed in just like any other watercolor would. So it's one of those things that you can hit it with a hairdryer to get it to dry a little faster, but it's definitely something that's going to be something you have to be aware of. You have a question?
Do you recommend using a cold press paper over a hot press paper or vice versa?
I'm glad you asked because the paper that we did the lines on earlier, that was a hot press. What Mott is working on right now is a cold press. You can use whatever makes you happy because both of them will work great. It just depends on how, I guess, really your preference. You have another question?
Aside from being able to reactivate gouache, is there a reason you would choose gouache over acrylic paint?
That's the biggest one,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even acrylic paints don't have the same opacity as gouache. Like there are some acrylic paints that can be opaque, but a lot of acrylics have a transparency to them as well.
And a lot of acrylics too will dry. One thing that gouache is really known for, and if you know the history of gouache, it was traditionally used for a lot of graphic design because it's great at being scanned. Because
Yeah.
unlike acrylic, it does not have a shiny kind of consistency to it.
There's no glare on this whatsoever, which is great because if I put that on a scanning bed, well, there's a slight glare on the gold.
For a good
Because
reason.
it's shiny, but that's gold. But for like, if this were to be reproduced in a magazine that had a article about whatever this type of bird is, do we ever figure that out? What kind of bird it is?
The Unsplash link said it's a yellow-billed stork.
Oh, it is a stork. There we go.
If this was used for a yellow-billed stork magazine article, the great thing is that you could very easily take that, put it on a scanner, like any kind of a scanner, really, and it should give you a very, very crisp, clean scan of the whole thing. Whereas, like, if you were to do that with a pencil, you can sometimes get a shine. Sometimes you also get that with the acrylics because it has that, glossiness to it. And if you were to take a photo of something that is glossy, you also might be struggling with it. Whereas this, even if you were to take a photo of it with like your phone or like if you have high-tech camera equipment, that would be something that you don't have to fuss with the lights as much with, just for the reproduction purposes, which is great.
Yes.
You have another question?
So you mentioned why you would choose gouache over acrylic, but why would you choose gouache over traditional watercolors?
That opacity. It's like we said, the handoff that you're doing, watercolor has transparency. If you want a really, really vibrant color that is transparent, watercolor is the one that you should choose. If you want a really, really vibrant color that is opaque, you should go for gouache.
And a lot of people have compared gouache to, if you work a lot with oils, a lot of people will consider gouache to be one of the closest mediums to oils because it can have that opacity but still be able to glaze, unlike watercolors.
Oh yeah.
I mean, watercolors can glaze,
Yeah.
but they're not opaque.
Yeah, they have that it's optically mixing at that point. Whereas like, I know with me, with my oil painting techniques that I usually use, I'm obliterating whatever underpainting that I'm working on, which is usually burnt sienna. So I'm popping in really bright, vibrant colors. And if it were transparent, then that burnt sienna is going to shine through and I would be frustrated and fighting with it. So it's just a different kind of media. And so if watercolors, traditional watercolors work best for you, use them. If gouache works best for you, it's something that is really, really fun in my opinion, and I think you should definitely give it a try.
Yeah. And the other wonderful thing about gouache is, I know a lot of plein air painters out there that traditionally would use oil will take gouache with them because it can dry a lot faster. There are ways to transport oil paintings around, but it's a lot easier if your painting's dry and you can just throw it in a sketchbook as opposed to like oil painting.
Yes. Oh, yes.
So I'm just throwing in a little bit, I'm trying to get a little bit of, trying to hint at details without painting all the details, kind of like what I did in here. I didn't like monotonously go through my reference photo and copy every single feather and everything on this, but I kind of used my color shifts to hint at that detail.
Yeah. And you went with that almost like peachy color.
Yeah.
Looks like a yellow ochre mixed with a little bit of your orange and white.
I actually just used straight yellow ochre mixed with this white.
Ooh, nice.
And this really kind of shows how vibrant these colors are, because yellow ochre traditionally, like you can see it over here in my palette. If I bring it over and try not to spill in everything, you can see This looks very much like a traditional yellow ochre, but as soon as I mixed it with water, it kind of brings out those really peachy tones.
Which is lovely. So you put that down first and then you went with white on top of it. So that's what we were talking about, the layering aspect of this, is that you can put the lighter colors on top of those darker colors and you don't have to worry about saving those lights. But you can definitely layer like that.
Yes.
Which is fantastic. Now, I'm going to give you just a little bit more time to paint, and then I'm going to just elbow you out of the way because it's about time for me to paint. And I'm the kind of person that, like, I want to paint.
Yeah, you're sitting here very patiently, I'll say.
Don't worry, your time is coming.
That sounds threatening.
Can you layer other mediums over gouache, or will it lift?
You absolutely should be able to. It depends on the medium. Mm-hmm. So
Specifically oils in this case?
That's a question. So traditionally, you don't want to put gouache on anything that is, it's essentially like a watercolor. You want to put it on paper. Oils you should not put on paper because the oil content will start to destroy the fibers of paper.
And I will say too, this might cause, since it's a water-based medium, when you start mixing water-based and oil-based mediums, because the binder is gum arabic and not an acrylic polymer, there can be like, they can try to start fighting each other a little bit. It might not like layer as smooth as it would if you're using an acryl gouache.
Yeah. Now, anything wet that you put on top of a traditional gouache is going to reactivate it. So oils might reactivate it, acrylics might reactivate it. If you do dry media like pastels, that is super fun, and I cannot suggest it any more than just telling you to go give it a whirl, because it is super, super fun, and it works really well.
Colored pencils too. Lots of people will pair this with colored pencils.
All right, I'm gonna elbow you out of the way. My turn. My turn to paint. All right, so the way that I work is a little bit differently. It's still a lot of layering, but I wanted to work in my sketchbook instead of a finished piece because I use gouache a lot of the times in my sketchbook, kind of a very quick painting, some kind of a color study type thing. So, I mean, I have a lot of gouache kind of studies, like this is a gouache, but this is mixed media. So the background is watercolor. I did a sketch with the Jumbo Jet, the Jerry's Jumbo Jet pencil. And that is an oil impregnated pencil. I was actually just doing this specifically to see if it would repel the water because it has an oil content in it. It doesn't really repel it that much, and I did a very light sketch. But then I did gouache on top of it, which is why I got that opacity that knocked out that blue. And then I went back in with a Jumbo Jet as well. And then this one is all gouache, with the exception of my line work, which is kind of how I'm going to be working today. So this is kind of how I function in my sketchbook. And here, I'll show you this. So this is kind of where I'm starting, and this is how I sort of end up. So what I do is I do a pencil sketch, and then I ink it with just a pen. I happen to use this pocket, I do this every time, pocket brush pen. Pocket brush pen. It's just the phrase that won't stick in my head. And then I honestly don't even erase out any of my pencils. Now, this one I tried to because, and I'm going to totally out myself on this one. I drew her in the wrong spot, and I drew her head slightly too big, so her hat was going to start going off the sketchbook here, and I didn't like that composition. So if you look closely here, what'd you call that, Katie? It looks like Jay Leno's chin. It ain't pretty. And again, it's my sketchbook. No one's really gonna be like, ooh, I can't believe you did that. But the way that I can work with this is that, here, let me actually pull some things down here. All right, so I work relatively fast with gouache because I paint fast in general, but I have just a couple of things on my palette here that I had used earlier. So I'm just gonna, this has been sitting out almost all day. It has like a skin formed on it, but it's gouache. I can reactivate it, not a problem. But I'm going to totally get my white muddy but I'm gonna mix like a really pretty, almost like, I want to say like a periwinkle blue kind of a color. I believe the blue that I have on my palette here is a cobalt, but what I'm looking for is like a chalky blue. I want chalky. I want that opacity of that white. But you see how much water I added? It's pretty fluid, right? It's like melted butter. So what I'm gonna do is just pretend like I never did that. And I'm going to carve around. And if I get a little bit of water, and I'm gonna make that go over here too, because I'm gonna pretend like it's part of this. Why not? It's on the same page. But let's go to that side. Oop, there we go. Too far, too far. All right, so the opacity of this media has completely removed my whoopsie pencil line, right? Now, this is what I was talking about when it comes to working in layers. If I wanted to start painting this hat or her lips, I would have to wait for this blue to completely dry, because if I don't wait for that to dry, it's gonna start bleeding in just like watercolors would, right? But I'm gonna work on, let me actually get a smaller flat brush, because I love my flat brushes. I'm gonna actually use a little bit of, let me do this rose, was that rose violet? And a little bit of the luminescent red. I want the two of them mixed. And I am just taking a little bit off my palette here and a little bit off my palette here. And I'm adding in a lot of water because I want this to act more like, hopefully you guys can see that. I'm adding a lot of water because I want it to be pretty transparent, almost like a watercolor, right? And then I'm going to give her a little bit of blush to where she looks like she's alive. And I know I just ruined it. Don't worry. It looks like I just ruined it. If I take a clean brush that is still wet and kind of pull the edges out, now it just looks like she's blushing. Isn't it so pretty? I'm gonna add just a little bit of that, a little bit more of that rose. Slight difference, and this is how fast it dries. It's not completely dry, but I can see it's dry enough to where I'm not going to have to worry about that bleeding. Now again, if it does, I can just paint over it. Let me do a little bit of that rose and that orange, right? Ta-da! Like, I would say, I'm going to try and turn this with all the things in my way. Sorry. Just like that, I would say that could be a finished sketch in my sketchbook. Not a problem. So that's the way that I work, really fast. Now, what's great is that if I decide that I really hate some of these lines, just like I did over here, I had lines that I had inked in right here. I did not like those lines. I felt like it made him look like his chin was going the wrong direction in space. Like it just made his chin look like it ended way over here where his neck was supposed to be, as opposed to kind of following around the form of his face. So I completely obliterated that with a gouache. And that's several layers though. Like you can see that I had quite a few layers, and I work with them in, some of them are like that luminescent red over here on the edge of that face. That's really, really opaque. That's using it like a gouache. And then over here where I do the thinner washes, this is where I'm using it kind of like watercolor, and I'm letting it optically mix. So like this kind of grayish purple that I had mixed in for like his 5 o'clock shadow areas and his neck, I had popped that in, and I also popped in a couple of wrinkles right here, and I let it fully dry. And when I put this kind of, I think that's burnt sienna wash, a really light burnt sienna wash, it reactivated with the lighter kind of pink color that I had already laid down, and then it also sort of reactivated that gray, and it softened the edges, but it optically mixed. So I wasn't really mixing it together. I was just laying down a chunk. Now while I was blathering on, I was really trying to make sure that this was dry because I want to work on something a little cuter. I know, that's a face. That's a face to be greeted with, but I wanted to work really fast on this guy. So let me pop him over here. Let me actually, I could probably do this. That probably would be working a little bit easier for you guys to see. So I have a reference photo, and of course our lovely moderators, Amanda and Frida, will pop in the reference for you guys to see. So this is something where I'm going to hopefully just be able to use whatever I have on my palette. This is a yellow ochre. Let's mix it with a little bit of burnt sienna for a kind of a orangey color. That's a little bit too orangey. So let's add a little bit of white to tone it down. And then I might just start popping in. And this is the part where I'm using it kind of like watercolor. I layer mine where I'm just kind of trying to find the colors right now. And if I don't like it, I can cover it up and it's okay. But when it comes to the very end, if I have some lines that I've kind of painted over, that I've painted over a little too much, I can pop those back in on top. Sorry, I'm trying to like, paint and talk is hard. Look at his little head. Also, this makes me want to squish my dog's face.
It makes me want to squish your dog's face.
This is not my dog, but yeah, it's just, I just want to like squeeze his little cheeks. But my dog is very similarly shaped, which is just funny and quirky. So I'm going to add that little luminescent red. And my brush is still pretty dirty right now, so it has that, the yellow ochre and kind of burnt sienna right now. So I'm going to kind of just bring this up, because the cool thing is that if I don't like it here, I can cover it up, like I said before. But if I don't fully cover it up, that bright color is going to shine through. I'm going to add a little bit of the toe pads, his little toe beans. Right? Something like that. And you know what, I'm going to actually take that same color and give him a little bit of pink in his eyes, because, you know, they still have that. Alright, and then I need to darken the little shadow, so I'm going to take a blue. I think this is the, yeah, this is the cobalt blue, and the burnt sienna will give me, it's a sort of a neutral. I usually add more cobalt than the burnt sienna right here. Hopefully you guys can see that. So I'm adding more cobalt to that than the burnt sienna, because if you do the other way around, it kind of gives you almost like a green, which is okay. You know, different blues will give you a different kind of shade, but I like that sort of neutrally dark shade. And if I pop that into the little shadows, I'll give him some dimensions. I don't know, I keep saying him. I don't know what kind of a dog this is. Could be a baby girl. Lady girl puppies.
Emmy, what kind of
Yes.
sketchbook are you using?
Oh, this is the
Handbook.
handbook? Yeah. Which is still in the teacher's cart as well. It's my personal sketchbook, which is why I grabbed it, because I ended up working in my sketchbook from home one of these days, so I was like, well, I guess I'm using that on the show. But it just happened to be a sketchbook that I had grabbed. It's a really great sketchbook. It does have, what is it, 140 pound, which is like 300 GSM paper. I could not find whether or not it was 100% cotton or not, so I couldn't tell you that. But it's a solid little sketchbook. All right, now I definitely need to add some more pink to his little ears. Again, I'm calling it a boy. I'm going to just assume it's a boy. And I'm going to add a little bit, not only that rose violet, but a little bit of that luminescent red, so where it's real poppy. Kind of brings that luminescent red back a little bit. And the cool thing is that I do love to not finish these. And you see how my brush stroke kind of skipped across the surface? That's telling me that I'm starting to get into dry brush territory, which is great if you want more expressive brush strokes. But if that's not something you are looking for, then you're gonna need to kind of add a little bit more water at those points. Now, again, if I decide that I don't like something, take a clean, wet brush, and I can, as long as I work quickly, I can pick the majority of it up, because I think that got a little too dark, right? I'm gonna add a little bit of purple in with that blue and burnt sienna mixture for another shadow color. I'm constantly mixing all kinds of different colors on my palette, and usually it's just a combination of whatever I had left on my brush with whatever I'm grabbing next, which is how I get my unity of like really funky colors. All right, now I'm not gonna worry about the highlights on his nose. I'm gonna just kind of color the whole thing purple. And actually I need more of that darker color here. Right. He's got his little eyebrows kind of going. Very expressive faces. All right, I'm gonna go back into that brown color that I had made earlier. Kind of give myself a little bit more hint of his fur. And actually, I'm going to mix in a lot more water to that. Same color, because I want to get just a really light wash. That is too light. There we go, a little bit more. Because I want to have a difference between the little white stripe on the middle of his face there and the rest of it. And again, if I'm not worried about the highlights, and all the colors that I laid down before have already started to dry. So like if I go over this, you can see now that it's tinting it, but it's not obliterating those edges, because I'm not overworking my brush strokes. I'm not going over, like I'm not scrubbing at it, you know? The more you scrub at those layers, the more they're going to reactivate. Because if I wanted to, I could reactivate it, but I don't. I need a little bit darker. So the other really fun shadow color that I really love is the bright violet and the burnt sienna. And that'll give you a very purpley red, which is right here. I do love that one so much. And you can see that where I just laid down that brush stroke, that was still wet because that I had not let dry, which is okay because it just kind of softened that. We're gonna kind of allow that to have like almost like a happy accident moment. Right. And now, quickly, because we are about 6:30, I'm gonna add just a couple of shadows, and then we are done with our little buddy here.
Emmy's painting very quietly here, and I want you guys to know that off camera I'm frantically mixing the moment she said we're gonna finish soon.
Yeah. All right, so for shadows, because I really didn't get to his little paws or anything. So I mean, I can still work on this if I'm, want to come back to this later. Not a problem. That's the joy of this being, in my sketchbook. Like if I can only work on it a little bit here and there, I could very easily do that. Now, to get my shadows, and if I want to have like that feathered edge, again, clean paintbrush that's wet. And I'm going to just kind of work. This is what I meant by like the more you scrub, the more you'll reactivate them. I'm just kind of working back into that edge because it already started to dry. And this will just soften a few of those edges to make it look, because with shadows, like it gets sharper the closer it is to the object touching the ground, and then it kind of fades off into space as it gets further away, and the further away from the ground that the object is. So if I fade out just some of these edges, actually this one I think I kind of want to do a little bit further out. Let's see. There we go. I think that's good. Trying not to block this and work in a sideways manner. Painting on camera is difficult. All right, so I think our little buddy is done. I still need to give it eyes. It doesn't have any color on its eyes, but that's okay. I actually said this to Katie earlier. I said, this dog reminds me of you. And I was like, it's color of its eyes. I swear that's what I meant. Because look at this little cutie. It's got the prettiest color eyes, and Katie has like the same color. So jealous. It's so pretty. But that's what I meant. I swear. It's not that you look like a cute squishy dog. But yeah, that's how I kind of work in my sketchbook. So it's real quick observations of color, laying it down. If I don't like it, I can cover it up. It's very similar to watercolors at this point. Now, if I would have far more time, you'll start seeing me mix more and more opaque colors. So this is kind of how I approach it, and then I start getting more and more opaque. Just like here, which of course, as I closed it, I was worried about this because this was still slightly wet. It picked up. That's okay. It's watercolor. I can still pick this, or not watercolor. It's gouache. It's opaque watercolor. I can still reactivate that and get rid of whatever just happened. It's not a big deal. This is what happens when you're working in a sketchbook from page to page. Just let it dry. But for his nose, I started getting way too dark, so I started popping in more of the white mixed in with the different pink colors, and the same thing with that, what is it, the scarlet red?
Permanent scarlet.
Permanent scarlet. So every red is going to give you different tones of pinks, whether they lean more towards like blues or whether they lean more towards oranges. And so those are the different colors that I was popping in, as well as the violets. So I brought that brightness back up to his nose, which is what it was missing, and it had gotten too dark. That's why I personally love gouache. And I would do the same thing with this. Like I'd pop in those highlights on his little nose, and maybe brighten the little stripe of white fur in his forehead, and then, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's the wonderful thing about gouache, is how workable it is.
Yes, it is so workable. So I hope you guys are inspired to give gouache a try. And of course, you know, if you have any other additional questions that we don't get through in today's show, even if you're watching this in the future, feel free to pop them in. We are always happy to kind of keep up with the questions that come through. And I know we are definitely out of time, so just a quick reminder though, Teacher's Cart. If you are looking for any of the items that we used during today's show, go to the website JerrysArtarama.com and type in today's class code, which is JL288. Type that in the search bar, and the Teacher's Cart should come up, and everything that we used is going to be in there for you to check out.
Yes, and if you try out gouache because you're inspired by something we did here, or you use one of our reference images for any kind of medium, feel free to join our Jerry's Live Facebook group. If you do join it, make sure you answer the security question, otherwise we will deem you a robot and we will not let you in, but we would love to see your art there. And next week's show topic is, it's a vendor show with Golden. They're going to be talking about their new Golden sets, and that show is going to be on Facebook only. So if you're on YouTube right now, head over to Facebook, otherwise you will not find us here.
And technically you don't have to join the Jerry's Live group in order to watch it on Facebook. It is on the Jerry's Artarama Facebook page, which is open to anybody to watch. You don't have to like join the group in order to do that. But we would still love to see you join and post your artwork there, because we'd love to see what you make. It's great. So that was it.
Yeah.
That was gouache.
Thank
I hope
you guys for
enjoyed
coming.
it. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
All right, we ready to go?
Yes.